Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Today we're going to be improving a few remaining pieces on the front page of the Paladins of Chivalry website. So first things first, we're going to change these stock photos. Nice and easy there. Just upload. This one is a little bit narrower than the stock photo that was originally there, so we're just going to go and fit it to the frame. And it's retained, you'll notice, the curvature on the edges that was previous. So that means if you do switch photos out in your website, all your other background settings will remain as you want them to, which is quite useful. And then this one, we're just going to put in a rather nice atmospheric crow on a castle. Then we can just go into the drop-down text, which you'll remember we titled before, and we're just going to populate that with some descriptive text to tell them about what living history is if you are a client coming to view the website, which is obviously quite important. And with all of that done, just a bit more typing there, and you can see it's live updating, no real problems. We save it, exit, and then we can just check it all works. Yep, works perfectly. Photos adjust with the size of the text display, and we're all done. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drachinifel. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Well, welcome to another section of Drac's library. Now this is a part you may have seen slightly in passing, but probably won't have seen in any great detail so far. This is part of what I call my primary resources section. There are other sections that have got primary resources scattered through them, but this is where I keep most of the primary resources that are in book form. There's a whole other section outside of this room that's got papers and photos and other loose items. But these are the books, or at least some of them. There's a bunch of them over here as well. But nonetheless, the reason that this video exists is some of you who've been following the channel for a while will remember way back, I showed you a basic method that most people can do for preserving glass slides and the occasional photograph if you don't have a scanner, just using a DSLR. Now, I do have a fairly powerful scanner now that I've been using to upload photos, and if you go to the drachinifel.co.uk website you can see some of them. But there is a problem. That particular scanner only goes up to just a fraction over A4 size paper. And some things, like books, come in sizes that are considerably greater than A4. And well, if you want to see the price of an A3 scanner that can do 600 dpi or greater, well, just prepare yourself for a bit of a shock. There's a very good reason I don't own one. Now, with that said, there are some materials that do need to be preserved, and to be honest, there are some materials I think need to be brought to wider audiences, but only a few copies might exist. I have some of those copies for some things. Some of you out there might have copies for other things, and are wondering, well, what's the best way of doing it? Well, again, I don't expect many of you to have a high-resolution A3 scanner either, and access to them in commercial areas can be quite expensive. So something is actually better than nothing, and we're going to demonstrate that, because there are some things, like, for example, this thing, and yes, this is very old. This is an original, oh, let's make sure I don't break it. This is an original book from 1641. Now, pardon my French, but it's entitled Les Fortifications des Chevaliers Antoine de Ville, then Tholocène avec l'attaque à la défense des places, Alliance chez Philippe Baud au temps 1641. Now, thank you. Now, as far as I can tell, having read through a good portion of it, this is essentially a early 17th century how to attack and how to defend star forts and similar for dummies. And in classic old style, it has, you know, La Fortification de Chevalier Antoine de Ville, and then all of this stuff which tells you what's in it. Now, it has got some watermarks and age marks from its long history, but it comes in, thankfully, very readable font. German people who thought that Gothic font was the best thing to write in, take note. And as is the case with classical literature, it has some poems in it. And then it goes on and you get complex mathematics set in nice wood engraving, etc., etc. And so it goes on. There's some nice diagrams in here as well. So, you know, various cross sections of siege ramparts and walls and so on and so forth. And here's another one, how to build a star fort. Now, that's something I need to get process scanned and ideally translated at some point in the future. Note, if anybody speaks French and does 17th century French and does a reasonable translation rates, you know where to find me. There's some slightly more prosaic ones. So this is the signal log of HMS Repulse from 1917 through to 1921. There's a bit of paperwork that someone's included there to explain what it is, but yeah. Wireless telegraphy signal log for His Majesty's ship, some various instructions, and then lots of handwriting. Of course, this is old school handwriting, so apologies for the phone going off. I'm going to have to put that on silent. Whether I edit this out or not depends on how amusing - embarrassing that particular incident was. But, you know, some of it is readable. So this entry here, torpedo warheads, contents, etc. Then something that seems to say disk reduces splitting of, I don't know what that means. Then heater torpedo, removal of controlling gear. Now that's readable. Whitehead detonator, Holden Mark III. Demands to TSO, Pretty's Yard, Gosport. So that's obviously in Portsmouth. So that's something else that could be preserved. And, you know, things go on. There's a bunch of French stuff here, actually. So what this one is, this is fabrication of iron for defensive purposes. This I'm actually going to do a bunch of videos based on, so I'm not going to go through that quite this minute. Report of the Chief of Ordnance, 1890. Artillerie Naval, there's quite a lot. There's a whole collection of brassies. House Executive Documents of 51st Session of Congress. I'm not entirely sure why I've got that, but I do. And then down here, just out of sight, damage control book for DD 866 from the Bureau of Ships, courtesy of the wonderful people over at Tin Can Sailors. So full diagrams and instructions on your damage control for DD 866. Again, something that at some point will be sorted. And then, as I said, down here, just out of sight, because the camera's only got so much field of view, we have some of the biggest and heaviest things, which is why they're down there. So this is Marine Artillery, Tome 1, literally tome, because yeah, this is difficult to hold up. And this is 19th century artillery, so cannon revolver Hotchkiss 37mm at 200 kilos, I think. And this is, as you can see, one of those wonderful Victorian diagrams where it's all in colour and has a bunch of plans, which are usually, there you go, Fusil Double Mod 1861, so 1861 pattern French musket, or maybe a rifled musket. Grémont, I don't know what Grémont means, my French isn't that good. And it kind of goes, oh, that's going to be a shell of some description, and something just fell out there. Projectiles pour canon de 16 cent. 16 cent, well, cent is 100. 1,600 pounds, so that's going to be fairly large. Oh, okay. There's I don't know if you can see that, but there's 162 millimeters, so that's just over 6 inches. That's like one of their weird measurements, the 163mm guns. But yeah, oh, that's just somebody's handwritten plans for it. Index. So, oh, my thinking hat fell over. So this is, you know, all stuff, good stuff that should be preserved. But there is only one of me and I have a lot of other things to be getting on with. So it will be preserved. I mean, at the moment it's in a fairly temperature controlled room, fairly safe, so we've got some time. But today I wanted to bring your attention in particular to one item, which is this, which as far as I can tell is kind of a sales brochure dash celebration of the company's achievements dash maybe a 1900s version of a coffee table book. This is made by Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée, or Méditerranée, 1900. More properly, the Société Nouvelle de Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée, which is a very long way of saying it was a private French shipbuilding company that had shipyards at Toulon, or near Toulon, and Le Havre. And a number of naval incidents that you'll have heard of on the channel actually involve ships showing up either to their shipyards for repairs. A couple of Russian ships did that when they had to sit down into the Mediterranean, but also Forges et Chantiers built a number of ships of varying degrees of notoriety that you may have heard of. Amusingly, it opens with the unpronounceable French ship that begins with J, one of their pre-dreadnoughts. Again, nice 19th - early 20th century coloured diagram, and then plan, side view and upper deck and engine deck, and then general description, armour, artillery, torpedoes, propulsion, the fact that it has electric illumination and how much that is, its dimensions. Now some of these ships are relatively detailed, covered like that. You have the Cesarevich, one of the Russian ships that was built for them by Forges et Chantiers. Pelayo, the Spanish pre-dreadnought, the only battleship they had during the Spanish-American War. And then it goes on with diagrams of their, or pictures of their engines. The Spezia, which was a Greek Navy ironclad. Ikitsushima, a Japanese cruiser. That's one of their Matsushima type very questionable cruisers. So the point of this is a 32-page document, and it's relatively nice, and so that is what I'm going to preserve today in digital form. Now I'm currently speaking to you via this camera, the DSLR Sony RX10 IV, but that is also the camera that I'm going to use to preserve this, or it's an element of what I'm going to use to preserve it. So what I'm going to do once this is done is I'm going to lay out this on the floor, and then I'm going to use the same tripod that I'm using now. So this is why, if you have a document that's too big to scan, or you don't have a scanner but you do have a DSLR, or even, to be honest, a phone, because a decent camera phone these days would probably be decent enough for this job, and I'm going to start photographing it. So using the tripod, tilt the camera down, make sure the lighting's good, and then take a picture of a page, make sure the focus is good, turn over, and so on and so forth. Now, okay, the lighting may not be particularly brilliant in here because there's a shocking great screen that's blocking 2/3 of the window, but again, it's better than nothing. You know, it's far, 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 far better from any historian's point of view for there to be a not brilliant but still legible set of scans of a document like this than for someone who has a document like this to just not ever scan it because they don't have a, you know, £3,000 scanner that can do it absolutely perfectly. And there are things that you can do with fairly basic bits of software like Windows Photos where you can adjust some of the lighting levels and so forth to improve the appearance somewhat. But it's always very important to also keep the original photos that you did, because sometimes other people can do better with those photos, because they will have complicated image processing software and so on and so forth. But the end result, ideally, once we get to the end of this video, will be that I will have, at least in some form, digitized this particular book, made it publicly available for everybody to look at, and I will also make available a zip file that contains the photos that I've taken in their original form, so if someone wants to play around with them, they can do. If you can hear barking, unfortunately that's Floppy the dog downstairs, I apologise. And then at some point in the future, either when I've got a better setup lighting-wise, or maybe, who knows, I'll win the lottery and I'll be able to afford that mythical A3, or to be honest, at that stage, maybe even I'll need an A2 scanner, then maybe I can follow that up with a further release of the book in fully scanned, you know, all singing, all dancing format. But the important thing is, if anything should happen to this in the interim, a digital copy now exists. So let's go and see that in motion. So here's some of the results, and I can briefly describe to you the setup. So, one camera tripod extended to maximum height with the DSLR that I mentioned earlier set on top of it. Then adjusting the angle down so the tripod was set up so the back had the leg coming straight backwards and the front had two legs splayed out. That meant I could get as close to vertical as possible without involving the tripod legs coming into view. Then zoomed out in to just a little bit bigger than the actual page. So there was a little framing of carpet. And then you take a protractor, work out the angle that the camera is facing, because I say it's not facing straight down vertical unless you happen to have a vertical camera set up. Once that's done, you then can use some foam or some other soft wedging material, or if you've got something a bit harder, maybe another book that you can prop at an angle but with a towel over it or something like that, to adjust the book that you're trying to scan to be at the same relative angle, so to make a direct line of sight. So for example, if your camera is pointing down 80 degrees, you need to elevate the book that you're trying to photograph by 10 degrees. And that obviously forms a 90-degree angle. Then you have lighting. Now, internal artificial lighting tends to be very yellow. In this case, the papers are a little bit yellow anyway because they're a bit old. So natural lighting should be best, but in circumstances where you can't get natural lighting or you can only get partial natural lighting, then you should try and get the maximum possible amount of artificial lighting. And if that involves bringing in a few extra lamps and positioning them around the book that's being photoed, then so be it, because you don't want any shadows and you want maximum levels of light exposure. But what you want to try and avoid is glare. So if you do look through the camera and you see a glare of light, then try and move the light so it's pointing not directly at the page itself. And if you can, if your camera is capable of it, try and shoot in RAW plus JPEG, because the RAW will be much more easy to post-process for others if you want to release those files. But if you've got a high-quality camera and you just want to shoot in JPEG, then that's fine as well. Another thing to acquire if you can, which I don't have at the moment, but I'm trying to look into getting, is a color swatch. Because, and so just for reference, this basically looks like a strip with various black lines and squares on it, but also a bunch of color squares. If you look at a lot of raw pictures from museums and so forth, you'll notice one of those somewhere in the picture at the edge. And this is because those colors are known quantities. So again, for someone who is able to professionally edit the photos, they can look at what the apparent color coming through is and compare that to what the actual color is and make very fine color adjustments. Now, once you've got all that in place, you can start taking photos, making sure that it's nice and steady. If you've got a tripod, then you can use just the default camera shutter. If you want to be a little bit more precise, you can set it up for maybe a 2-second delay to avoid any minor adjustments or vibration from you touching it. Or if you happen to have a slight sort of semi-professional camera setup, you might have a remote trigger. That can also work. But in any case, you have the photos. You then take them into processing. First thing you do, crop them down to the size of the page, so eliminate the carpet and any other similar stuff. And then you can do some basic photo editing. Now, as I said before, you do always want to keep the originals as well. But for really basic stuff, if you're running Windows, then putting it into Windows Photos and then just hitting the auto adjust. That's usually not terrible. And then you can play around with the contrast and brightness sliders slightly. Always good to have the original document to hand so you can see if your representation on screen is something close to what you see in person. And then save a copy, obviously, label it, number it, and then you will have a nice series of JPEGs like this. And really, if that's all you've got, a camera and a basic computer, then that's perfectly fine. You can then package them all up into a zip file and make them available for other people to use. Obviously, if you are going to make the original JPEGs or even original RAW files available, then keep them in a separate folder so they don't get confused. But that's really all there is to it. So for very basic book preservation, it's obviously easier to do when you've only got a couple of dozen pages as opposed to lots and lots and lots of pages, which is what scanners and so forth are for. But hopefully this little tutorial has been relatively useful for you. And yeah, if you look in the video description, you should find a link to basically the book in PDF form, which includes the pictures you've just been seeing now. And you'll also find a link to the zip file, which has the original JPEGs that I took. So if you want, you can compare and contrast my editing from original photo to what you see now. And if you really want to have a play around, you can obviously have a play around and see if you can do a bit better than me. You're always welcome to have a go. In any case, thanks very much for listening, and see you again in another video.